Welcome to The Real Reads Review, your go-to podcast for engaging, conversational, of nonfiction books review. We dive deep into the real stories, big ideas, and powerful insights shaping our world today. Whether you're a curious reader or just looking for your next great read, this is the place to explore the books that matter. Let's get into it.
Negotiation. It's not just for boardrooms anymore. In fact, you've probably negotiated at least 3 times today without even realizing it.
That's fascinating. I never really thought about how much negotiation plays a role in our daily lives. Can you give us some examples?
Well, think about deciding what to have for dinner with your partner, asking for a raise at work, or even bargaining with your kids about their bedtime. These are all forms of negotiation that we engage in regularly.
Now that you mention it, I can see how those everyday interactions are actually negotiations. It's quite eye-opening.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that successful negotiation begins with understanding human nature. For years, people thought negotiation was all about logic and rational discussion. But behavioral studies have shown that's not the case at all.
So you're saying we're not as rational as we'd like to think we are?
Precisely. We're driven by cognitive biases, emotions, and instincts. Think about impulse purchases, for example. How many times have you bought something on a whim, only to wonder later what you were thinking?
Oh, I'm definitely guilty of that. So how does this understanding of human nature apply to negotiation?
Well, it emphasizes the importance of psychological awareness in negotiations. It's not just about presenting logical arguments, it's about understanding the other person's motivations, limitations, and emotions. One key technique is active listening.
Active listening? Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure, it's not just about staying silent while the other person talks. It's about truly engaging and making them feel heard. A great way to do this is through mirroring, repeating someone's words or subtly mimicking their body language.
That's interesting. I've actually noticed waitstaff doing that when they repeat my order back to me. It does make me feel like they're really paying attention.
Exactly. And it's not just about what you say, but how you say it. Tone of voice is crucial in negotiations. A playful, positive tone can make the other party more cooperative, while a calm, authoritative tone can project control and stability.
I can see how that would be effective. I remember a time when I was in a heated argument with a friend, and when I consciously lowered my voice and spoke more slowly, it seemed to diffuse the tension almost immediately.
That's a great example of using your voice to manage emotions in a negotiation. And speaking of emotions, there's a compelling case for not avoiding them, but rather recognizing them as valuable clues.
That's surprising. I always thought emotions were something to be suppressed in negotiations. How can they be valuable?
Well, emotions reveal what people need and value most. There's a concept called tactical empathy, which involves identifying and verbalizing what the other person feels. It's a process called labeling.
So how would that work in practice?
Let's say you're in a tense work situation. You might say something like, "It seems like you're feeling pressured about this deadline." By acknowledging their emotions, you're not only showing understanding, but also building trust, which is essential for successful negotiation.
I can see how that could be powerful. You know, I actually tried something similar in a recent salary negotiation. Instead of just focusing on numbers, I acknowledged the stress on both sides.
That's a great application of tactical empathy. How did it go?
It went surprisingly well. My boss seemed to appreciate that I understood the company's perspective, and it led to a more open discussion about what was possible within the constraints.
That's fantastic. It really shows how these techniques can be applied in real-life situations. Now, let's talk about something that might seem counterintuitive at first: the power of no in negotiations.
Oh, that is surprising. I always thought no was something to avoid in negotiations. How can it be powerful?
Well, no can actually be a valuable tool. It helps clarify boundaries and expectations, and it can create space for better options. Sometimes by saying no, you open up a discussion about priorities or additional resources.
I can see that. I remember a time when I was hesitant to say no to a project at work, even though I knew I didn't have the capacity for it. It ended up causing a lot of stress and ultimately affected the quality of my work.
Exactly. And interestingly, forcing a no from your counterpart can be beneficial. By asking questions that prompt a no, you can actually gain more insight into what the other person really wants.
That's clever. It's like a way of getting more information without directly asking for it. Are there any other surprising strategies you can share?
Yes, actually. Another interesting point is about avoiding the trap of compromise. Many people think that compromise or splitting the difference is the goal in negotiations. But this often leads to unsatisfying outcomes for both parties.
That's counterintuitive. If we're not aiming for compromise, what should we be doing instead?
The key is focusing on finding a solution that serves your priorities while acknowledging the other person's needs. One technique is using time as a bargaining chip. Setting deadlines can create a sense of urgency without compromising on your requirements.
I can see how that could work. I've noticed that some of my best work happens when I'm up against a deadline. Are there any other strategies for finding these win-win solutions?
Absolutely. The importance of fairness in negotiations can't be overstated. Mentioning fairness can trigger people's emotional responses and prompt them to reevaluate their stance. Instead of saying, I want this, you could say something like, I'm only asking for what's fair based on industry standards.
That's a smart approach. It frames your position as reasonable without being confrontational. It seems like a lot of these techniques are about managing emotions and perceptions.
You're absolutely right. And that brings us to another key technique, labeling. We touched on this earlier when we talked about tactical empathy, but it's worth exploring in more depth.
Can you remind us what labeling involves?
Sure, labeling is about putting a name to the emotions you observe in the other person. It's a powerful tool for calming tensions and clarifying the situation. For example, if you're in a heated discussion, you might say something like, it sounds like you think I wasn't listening.
I can see how that could be effective. It acknowledges the other person's feelings without escalating the situation. Is there a trick to doing this well?
The key is to target deeper feelings, not just surface level issues. This requires careful observation of tone, body language, and even what isn't being said. It's about reading between the lines.
All of this makes me realize how much information we might be missing in our everyday interactions. Are there any other techniques for uncovering these hidden motivations?
Absolutely. There's a concept called black swans, unexpected pieces of information that can completely shift a negotiation. Finding these requires being alert to nonverbal signs, changes in tone, and even casual comments that might reveal something important.
That sounds intriguing. Can you give an example of how this might work in practice?
Sure, let's say you're negotiating with a supplier. During casual small talk, they might mention something about preferring long-term clients. That could be a black swan, a piece of information that gives you leverage in negotiating a longer contract.
I see. So it's about picking up on those little details that might not seem important at first glance. It sounds like you need to be a bit of a detective.
Exactly. And face-to-face interactions make it easier to spot these black swans because you can pick up on body language cues. It's all about being observant and piecing together the puzzle of what the other person really wants or needs.
This all ties into the idea of leveraging emotions to steer the outcome of a negotiation, doesn't it?
You're spot on. There are different types of leverage. Positive leverage that aligns with the other person's desires, negative leverage that plays to their fears, and normative leverage that taps into their moral values or personal rules.
That's interesting, but it also sounds like it could be manipulative if not used carefully. How do we ensure we're using these techniques ethically?
That's an excellent point. It's crucial to use these techniques ethically. It's not about manipulation, but about creating win-win situations where both parties feel heard and respected. The goal is to understand the other person's perspective deeply, not to exploit their vulnerabilities.
I appreciate that perspective. It reminds me that at the heart of all this, negotiation is really about human connection and understanding.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the final key point, The importance of preparation. Many people overlook this, but preparation is even more important than persuasion.
I can definitely relate to that. I've been in situations where I wished I'd prepared more thoroughly. What kind of preparation would you recommend?
Before any negotiation, it's crucial to study the other person's needs, motivations, and emotions. Try drafting potential roadmaps based on the person's personality and priorities. It's about being ready to adapt and handle surprises.
This all sounds like it could be incredibly useful, not just in formal negotiations, but in all kinds of everyday interactions. How can we start incorporating these techniques into our daily lives?
Well, that's the beauty of it. These techniques can improve all our communications, from family discussions to workplace interactions. Start by practicing active listening in your everyday conversations. Try mirroring people's words and see how it affects the interaction.
That sounds doable. Any other simple exercises we can try?
Absolutely. Try using labeling in your next disagreement with a friend or family member. Instead of arguing your point, try to identify and verbalize their emotions. You might be surprised at how it changes the dynamic of the conversation.
I'm definitely going to give that a try. It seems like these skills could really transform our relationships and interactions.
They certainly can. And remember, negotiation isn't about winning at all costs. It's about finding solutions that work for everyone involved. The more we practice these skills, the better we'll become at navigating all kinds of social situations.
This has been a fascinating discussion. I know I'll be looking at my daily interactions differently from now on.
Me too. And that wraps up our exploration of the art of negotiation. Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and don't be afraid to negotiate.
There is another great source to learn on different topics. The Read Between podcast engage in discussions that dive into the most thought-provoking articles published today. Join us looking on Spotify and other platforms. Remember, The Read Between